welcome to whispers in the dark. Lower the lights, close the door, and listen carefully. Tonight's story is an expanded horror retelling of one of Hans Christian Andersen's darkest tales, The Girl Who Trod on the Loaf. It is a story about vanity, cruelty, hunger, and the terrible weight of a single piece of bread. If grim fairy tales and journeys into places no living soul should see are what bring you back to this channel, you are in the right place. Settle in and remember this warning. There are some stains that mud can leave upon a shoe, and there are other stains that no water on earth can ever wash away. Now, let's begin. In a poor village in the Danish countryside, where the thatched roofs crouched beneath the wind, and the black forest pressed close to the fields, there lived a girl named Inga. She was born in a cottage so small that the smoke from the hearth never truly left it. It clung to the rafters, darkened the straw, and settled in the lungs of everyone who slept there. In winter, frost grew on the inside of the windows. In summer, flies gathered on the sour milk and the crusts of rye bread. Her father worked when work could be found. Her mother walked into the forest to gather fallen branches, carrying them home in a bundle that bent her back and rubbed the skin from her shoulders. There was little food, little warmth, and little rest. Yet poverty was not the darkest thing in that cottage. The darkest thing was growing behind Inga's pretty eyes. She was a beautiful child. Strangers said so, and because they said it often, Inga learned early that beauty could serve as a small crown. Her hair caught the sun like polished flax. Her cheeks were pale and smooth. Her eyes were bright, though their brightness was not kind. When she smiled, grown people forgave her rudeness. When she lied, they sometimes believed her because such a lovely mouth seemed made for sweeter words. Her mother did not mistake that loveliness for goodness. When Inga was very small, she caught flies against the cottage window. She pinched them between two fingers, plucked away their wings, and placed them on the sill. Then she watched them crawl in frantic circles, while the light warmed their helpless bodies. She called them her little dancers. When she grew older, she caught May bugs and black beetles. She pushed needles through their shells and fixed them to the wooden table. Beside their struggling feet, she laid scraps of green leaf or little pieces of paper. The insects clutched at these with desperate legs, turning the scraps again and again as they fought to pull themselves free. Inga would bend close enough to hear the faint scratching. "The May bug is reading," she would say. "See how it turns the pages." Sometimes the insect tore itself around the needle. Sometimes a leg came away. Sometimes the scratching continued long after Inga had gone to bed. Her mother would enter the room, find the creature still twisting beneath the moonlight, and end its misery with a stone. Then she would look toward her sleeping daughter and wonder what kind of soul could rest so peacefully beside suffering it had made. Inga did not limit her cruelty to insects. She laughed when a lame dog stumbled. She tipped a nest from a low branch just to see whether the featherless chicks would survive the fall. She smeared soot on another girl's dress before church. then watched the girl take the blame for being careless. If her mother scolded her, Inga stared back with a calmness colder than disobedience. "You will bring misfortune down upon yourself," her mother warned. "When you were little, you trampled upon my apron. When you are older, I fear you will trample upon my heart." Inga only smiled. The warning pleased her. It made her feel powerful enough to crush something that beat inside another person's chest. Years passed, and Inga's beauty sharpened. So did her pride. The village girls wore patched wool and rough shoes, but Inga carried herself as though coarse cloth were an insult devised especially for her. She despised the cottage walls, the smoky rafters, her father's cracked hands, and the crooked shape of her mother's back. Hunger did not teach her gratitude. It taught her to hate anyone who reminded her that she had once been hungry. At last, people of distinction who lived in a fine house in the country heard of the pretty village girl and took her into their service. Their house stood beyond broad fields and a line of white birches. It had tall windows that shone at sunset, painted rooms, linen sheets, copper pots, and cupboards that smelled of spice. To Inga, it seemed less like a home than a world built to prove that her childhood should never have happened. Her mistress treated her kindly. She gave Inga clean dresses, ribbons, stockings, and shoes of soft leather. She taught her household duties gently and spoke to her as if she were a daughter rather than a servant. The other people in the house were patient with her mistakes. At the long kitchen table, there was always enough to eat, but kindness did not soften Inga. It fed what was worst in her. Each new dress made the memory of her mother's rags more shameful. Each full plate made her despise the cottage where a heel of bread had once been divided into 3 portions. She studied herself in polished metal and darkened window glass. She learned which angle made her face look finest. She learned to pass poorer servants without seeing them. When visitors praised her beauty, she carried the words away and polished them in her mind until they shone brighter than prayer. After about a year, her mistress called her into a sunny room and told her she ought to visit her parents. Inga agreed, but not because she missed them. She wanted the village to see what she had become. She chose a good dress and arranged her hair. She cleaned her shoes until they reflected the sky. Then she walked back toward the poor village, imagining the envy she would awaken. In her mind, girls stopped speaking when she passed. Boys stared. Her mother wept with gratitude for the honor of seeing such a fine daughter. But as Inga reached the village pond, she saw the young men and women gathered there, talking in the pale afternoon. On a stone nearby sat her mother. The woman had come from the forest with a bundle of firewood tied across her shoulders. Her skirt was stained. Her shoes were split. Strands of gray hair clung to the sweat on her face. She looked older than Inga remembered and far smaller. For one uncertain instant, the mother lifted her head. Perhaps she sensed her child nearby. Perhaps the heart knows when the foot meant to crush it has drawn close. Inga turned away, before their eyes could meet. She took another path out of the village and returned to the fine house. She felt no sorrow. She felt only irritation that her mother had been sitting where people could see her. That night, the poor woman waited outside the cottage until the moon rose. She had heard that someone dressed beautifully had been seen near the pond. She knew who it was. Mothers often know the shape of a wound, even when no one admits that a blade was drawn. She waited anyway. Inga slept beneath clean linen and dreamed of shoes. Another half-year passed. Autumn came. Rain filled the cart ruts and soaked the meadows. The forest floor turned black beneath rotting leaves. Mist gathered over the marshes, and villagers said that the Marsh Woman was brewing below. Everyone knew of the elf maidens, her nieces, who danced in moonlit clearings and lured wandering men toward graves or water. Songs had been written about them. Pictures showed their white arms and their hollow backs, but little was said about their aunt, the Marsh Woman. People only knew that when summer meadows steamed and the ground breathed foul vapor, her great vats were boiling somewhere under the earth. There were old people who crossed themselves when the mist rose. There were shepherds who had heard metal lids clanging beneath the bog. One drunken woodcutter claimed he had seen a yellow eye open in a pool where no creature lived. No one believed all of these tales, but no one willingly walked the marsh road after dark. One morning, Inga's mistress called her again. "You must go home someday and see your old parents, little Inga," she said. "Take them this. They will be happy to see you." She placed a large loaf of white bread in Inga's arms. It was not the coarse, dark bread of the poor. It was pale and soft, baked from good flour, with a golden crust that cracked faintly under Inga's fingers. It was heavier than she expected. Warmth still lived at its center, and the smell filled the room. For a moment, Inga remembered the cottage table and her mother's hands dividing a hard crust. The memory did not move her to love. It merely made her eager to be rid of the loaf and the duty attached to it. She dressed in her best clothes. She put on her fine new shoes. She lifted her skirt high enough to keep its hem from the wet ground and began the journey. The sky hung low. Bare branches clicked together in the wind. Crows followed her from tree to tree, their black heads turning as if they knew where she was going. The loaf rested against her arm, leaving a trace of flour on her sleeve. By midday, she reached the marsh path. Rain had drowned it. A long stretch of mud and shallow water lay between Inga and the firm road beyond. Rushes shivered at the edges. Bubbles rose from the black surface, swelled, and burst with a smell of eggs, stagnant water, and something long dead. Inga stopped. She could turn back and take a longer way through the fields. She could remove her shoes and carry them. She could walk through the mud and wash afterward. None of these choices occurred to her as acceptable. The shoes were beautiful. They were the proof that she no longer belonged to the cottage. To stain them would be to let poverty touch her again. She looked at the loaf. Bread was sacred to hungry people. Bread was labor, rain, seed, harvest, milling, fire, and mercy. Bread was what her mother had gone without so that Inga might eat. Bread was the gift she had been trusted to carry home. Inga saw only a broad, dry surface. She tossed the loaf into the mud. It landed crust upward. The water trembled around it. For a heartbeat, the marsh went completely still. Even the rushes ceased their whispering. Inga placed one fine shoe upon the bread. The crust gave a soft sigh. She lifted her other foot to step across. The loaf sank. At first it lowered only a finger's width, and Inga frowned. Then the mud closed over the edge of the crust and gripped her shoe. She tried to pull free. The bread clung to her soul as if nailed there. She threw out her arms. The loaf sank deeper. Mud covered her ankle. It was not wet as ordinary mud was wet. It was cold and muscular. It tightened around her leg in slow contractions, like a throat attempting to swallow something too large. Inga screamed. Across the field, a cow herd standing on the brow of a hill heard her cry and turned. He saw the finely dressed girl balanced on nothing, saw her arms tearing at the empty air, and saw the black pool widen beneath her. Inga reached for the rushes, but they leaned away. The mud climbed to her knees. Beneath the surface, fingers seemed to close around her calves. Not human fingers. They were too many, too thin, and jointed in too many places. She felt nails or claws or small hard mouths scraping through her stockings. She begged for help. She promised anything. Yet even then she did not call for her mother. She called for her mistress. She called for servants. She called for anyone from the fine house who might see the dress and shoes and understand that a person of value was being taken. The marsh reached her waist. Her skirt spread on the surface like a drowned flower. Mud poured through the cloth and crawled over her skin. Something long moved beneath her clothes and wound itself around her ribs. She tried to breathe, but the pressure squeezed the sound from her. The cow herd ran down the hill. He was still far away when Inga's shoulders went under. For a final instant, her face remained above the pool. The beauty she had worshipped was distorted by terror. Her mouth gaped. Her eyes bulged. Black water filled her ears, her nostrils, and the corners of her lips. Then the earth swallowed her head. The cow herd reached the place and found only a black, bubbling pool. One bubble grew larger than the others. It stretched into a smooth dome. Inside it, he thought he saw a pale face pressing outward, the mouth moving soundlessly behind the oily skin. Then the bubble burst. Far below, Inga continued to fall. The mud did not rush past her. It passed through her. It entered her mouth and filled her throat, yet she did not drown. It pressed into her ears and behind her eyes, yet she remained conscious. She descended through roots that groped like buried hands. Worms slid across her lips. Stones scraped her skin. She felt the weight of the earth above her increasing until it should have crushed every bone, but something below wished her whole. It wished her able to feel. At last, the darkness beneath her opened. Inga fell from a ceiling of dripping roots and landed on the loaf. It struck a stone floor with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Pain shot from her foot through her spine. She tried to collapse, but could not. Her body remained upright, balanced upon the bread. She had arrived in the brewery of the Marsh Woman. A cesspool would have seemed a clean palace beside that place. The chamber stretched beyond the reach of sight, crowded with vats that rose taller than houses. Some were made of green metal. Some appeared to be carved from black bone. Others were swollen membranes bound with hoops, poolsing as if the vessels themselves were alive. Every vat boiled. One released the odor of graves opened after rain. Another breathed out the sweetness of spoiled meat. A third exhaled the stink of fevered bodies, old blood, wet fur, and teeth rotting in the gum. Vapors met beneath the low ceiling and formed greasy clouds. Condensation fell in warm, fat drops. The floor moved. Inga looked down and saw that it was hidden beneath toads, snakes, pale grubs, and creatures for which she knew no name. The toads were bloated to the size of dogs. Their skin hung in translucent folds, showing slow organs beneath. When they opened their mouths, they barked with the breathless cough of sick old men. Snakes wound through them, slick and heavy, their bellies distended by meals that still struggled inside. Between the vats crawled things that had once perhaps been human thoughts. They had infant hands, spider legs, and eyeless heads. Whenever one found a scrap of darkness deeper than the rest, it burrowed into it and made a sound like whispering through clenched teeth. The cold was worse than the smell. It was not the clean cold of winter air. It was the cold of deep soil, drowned flesh, and stones beneath graves. It entered Inga through the mud packed under her nails. It settled in her joints. She tried to shiver, but each movement became smaller than the last. The loaf remained fixed to her shoe. She pulled upward, and the bread stretched like living muscle, then snapped her foot back into place. Threads of amber light ran from the crust into the floor. They tightened around her ankle and drew her rigid, as amber draws and holds a slender fiber. Inga's hands stiffened, her elbows locked. Her spine hardened one bone at a time. The change climbed through her neck and into her jaw. Soon, she could move nothing but her eyes. The Marsh Woman was home. She came from behind a vast copper vat, stirring its contents with the trunk of a dead tree. Her body was wide and low, wrapped in dripping sedges. Moss grew from the folds of her face. Her hair consisted of long roots knotted with fish bones, and two small flames burned deep within the pits where her eyes should have been. Each time she stirred, shapes rolled to the surface of the brew. Inga saw a wedding ring, a child's wooden horse, a priest's collar, a severed braid of hair, and hundreds of white fingers opening and closing. The Marsh Woman pushed them down with her paddle. She was entertaining visitors that day. The devil stood near the hottest vat, tall enough that his head vanished in the smoke. Inga could not look directly at him. Whenever her eyes moved toward his shape, she saw a different terror. A horned shadow, a handsome face with empty sockets, a black mouth opening across the entire ceiling, a man wearing her father's skin. All of them smiled. Beside him sat his great-grandmother. She was a poisonous old creature, thin as a needle and dry as a dead wasp. Spectacles with thick, yellow lenses enlarged her eyes until they filled half her face. She had brought her needlework, for she was never idle. Across her lap lay strips of human leather. She stitched them into small pieces to be placed secretly inside people's shoes, so their feet would blister and their bodies would never find rest. From black thread, she embroidered lies that would pass from friend to friend until love was strangled. She gathered careless words that might have fallen harmlessly to the ground, sharpened them, dipped them in spite, and sewed them into slander. Each pull of her needle made someone in the world above wake, with hatred in the heart. The old creature noticed Inga. She set her sewing aside, lifted the spectacles on her nose, and peered so closely that Inga saw tiny faces swimming in the wet surfaces of her eyes. "That girl has talent," the great-grandmother said. Her voice was the sound of rats worrying a coffin. "Let me have her as a remembrance of my visit. She will make a fine statue for the antechamber of my great-grandchildren." The Marsh Woman grinned. Beneath the hanging moss, her teeth were flat stones crowded with small red worms. She tapped Inga on the forehead with one muddy finger. The brewery vanished. There was no journey, no sense of being carried. One horror simply closed, and another opened around her. Inga had gone to hell by a roundabout way. She stood in an antechamber without end. Looking forward made her dizzy. Looking behind made her more dizzy still. Walls receded through distances that no building could contain. High above, a ceiling hung like the underside of a storm, and immense doors appeared at intervals along the chamber. Behind those doors waited mercy, or so the prisoners believed. None knew when they might open. The floor was crowded with anxious, exhausted souls. They did not burn. Fire would have been a simple pain, and the torment here was carefully matched to the hidden shape of every sin. A miser stood nearby, clawing at empty pockets. He had forgotten the key to his money box. He knew that all he had loved lay locked beyond his reach, but the box moved each time he searched for it. His fingers had worn down to the bone from feeling along the floor. A liar vomited black ribbons covered in every word he had twisted. The ribbons wound around his throat, and when he tore them away, more came up. A woman who had lived for admiration wore 1,000 mirrored eyes upon her skin. Each eye showed her as she had feared she looked, and every reflection whispered the praise given to someone else. There were those who had enjoyed the hunger of others. They sat before tables piled with steaming food. Whenever they reached out, their arms bent backward at the wrist and fed the feast into mouths growing from the walls. Huge spiders crawled above them all. They were pale and fat, their bodies marked with hourglass shapes that contained real falling sand. For thousands of years, they had spun webs across the prisoners' feet. The strands tightened like screws, hardening into manacles stronger than copper. The more a soul struggled to reach the doors of mercy, the deeper the web cut. Every person in that endless hall was filled with unrest. It scraped behind the ribs. It fluttered in the throat. It told them there was somewhere else they must be, and something urgent they had forgotten, though they could never remember what it was. Inga could not move at all. The loaf held her to the ground. Its scent rose around her, still warm, still fresh, impossibly preserved. The crust beneath her shoe cracked now and then, and each tiny sound was louder to her than thunder. This is what comes of wanting clean feet, she thought. The other souls stared. Their eyes glowed with envy, hatred, appetite, and mad amusement. Their mouths moved, but no voices emerged. In the silence, Inga understood everything they wished to say. Pretty girl, fine girl, look at your shoes now. Inga tried to turn away, but her neck was stone. She could only roll her eyes. She told herself that they stared because she was beautiful. She still had a fine face and good clothes. Perhaps even here, among the damned and the waiting, she could be envied. Then she saw what the brewery had done to her. Her dress was heavy with clots of slime. Each clot breathed through little holes. A snake had braided itself into her hair, wound twice around her neck, and let its blunt head dangle over her chest. Whenever she swallowed, its coils tightened. From every fold in her skirt, a toad thrust out its face and gave a sick, choking bark. Something inside her sleeve began laying eggs against her skin. She felt each one slide into place. At least the others are hideous too, she thought. It was the only comfort her pride could find. Then hunger awakened. It began as a small emptiness, no worse than the evenings of her childhood when the cottage cupboard held nothing. But it did not pass. It deepened. It opened inside her like another mouth. The bread was directly beneath her. If she could bend, she might break away a corner. If she could move one hand, she might scrape crumbs from the crust. But her back was rigid. Her arms and fingers were stone. Her foot was fused to the very food her body demanded. The smell became unbearable. She could sense the loaf's soft center. She imagined the pale bread tearing, imagined pressing it between her teeth, imagined swallowing. Saliva flooded her mouth and ran down her fixed chin. The drops struck the loaf and vanished into it. Her stomach cramped. The pain tightened until it felt as though a wire had been wrapped around her organs and twisted. Then came a second pain, smaller and sharper. Something had begun to nibble at her from within. She remembered the insects turning on the pins. She remembered how patiently she had watched. A fly crawled across her cheek. Inga tried to shake it away. Nothing moved. The fly reached the corner of her eye and stepped onto the wet surface. Its wings had been torn off. Another followed, then 10, then hundreds. They came from cracks in the floor, dragging swollen bodies on crooked legs. Some carried fragments of green leaf. Some clutched scraps of paper. They spread across Inga's face and entered beneath her eyelids. She could still move her eyes, and in panic, she rolled them backward. The flies followed. Their feet scratched over the delicate globes. Their mouths tasted her tears before she could shed them. May bugs climbed the statue of her body. Each had a hole through its shell. Each dragged a rusted needle behind it. They gathered beneath her sleeves and pushed the needles into her flesh. Slowly, with tireless legs, they turned. No blood came. Stone does not bleed. Stone only remembers pressure. Inga tried to scream, but her jaw would not open. The scream remained inside, circling her skull. It had nowhere to go, and so she heard it without pause. If this lasts much longer, she thought, I cannot endure it. The antechamber answered her without sound. You will. Time did not move normally there. A second could swell until it contained a year. A century could pass between 2 bites of hunger. Inga never slept. She never fainted. Every sensation arrived whole and stayed. At some unknowable hour, a hot tear fell upon her forehead. It burned like molten iron. The tear ran down her face, across the snake at her neck, and over the slime covering her dress. It reached the loaf and hissed against the crust. Another fell, then another. Far above, her mother was weeping. A mother's tears for a lost child can reach places where sunlight cannot. But grief alone does not redeem. In the antechamber, those tears became fire. They scorched tracks across Inga's skin and made the rigid shell smoke. Soon she became so hollow from hunger that every sound in the world above entered her. She heard the cow herd telling what he had seen from the hill. She heard neighbors gather in the cottage. She heard them murmur about the loaf, the fine shoes, and the black pool. She heard her mother. Pride goes before a fall, the poor woman sobbed. You have ruined yourself, Inga. How you have grieved your mother. I feared this. I feared it from the beginning. Inga's heart did not soften. I wish I had never been born, she thought. Her tears cannot help me now. She heard her father sit without speaking. His silence was worse than accusation, so she turned her anger toward him too. Then the voices of her employers reached her. The good people who had clothed her, fed her, and treated her as their own child spoke with sorrow. She did not value the gifts of our Lord, they said. She trampled them underfoot. It will be hard for the gates of mercy to open for her. They should have raised me better, Inga thought. They should have beaten the wickedness out of me if they saw it. The devil's great-grandmother had embroidered such thoughts for centuries. Threads of them drifted through the antechamber, seeking any heart willing to take them in. One settled around Inga's heart and pulled tight. Above, a song was written about her. It told of the haughty girl who stepped upon bread to keep her shoes clean. Travelers carried it from village to village. Children sang it beside wells. Workers sang it in fields. The melody slipped through the earth and entered the endless hall. Whenever the song reached the line about the loaf, the bread beneath Inga's foot swelled. Its soft interior pushed between cracks in the crust like pale flesh. A warm smell filled her nose. Her hollow stomach folded upon itself. Why should I suffer so much for such a little thing, she thought. Others have done worse. If every sinner were punished, this chamber would not be large enough. The chamber was large enough. She heard children being told her story as a warning. They called her wicked Inga. They said she was nasty and deserved punishment. Their young voices, sharp with the certainty of those who have never been tested, fell upon her like pebbles thrown into a grave. With every judgment, Inga became harder. Hatred sealed the cracks in her stone shell. Bitterness filled the space where remorse might have grown. She despised her mother for grieving, her employers for judging, the children for singing, and every soul around her for witnessing her humiliation. No one could become good in such company, she told herself. She did not want to become good. Goodness was only another word used by comfortable people while someone else starved. The loaf's fragrance rose. The wingless flies scraped her eyes. Inside her, the small mouths continued to eat. Years passed in the world above. In the antechamber, hunger counted everyone. Then one day, Inga heard her story told to a little girl. The child listened as countless children had listened before. She heard about the flies, the beetles, the poor mother by the pond, the gift of white bread, and the fine shoe descending upon the crust. She heard that Inga had sunk into the marsh and gone where wicked pride leads. But this child did not laugh. She did not call Inga nasty. She began to cry. Will she never come up again? The little girl asked. Never, she was told. Not even if she asks forgiveness and promises never to be bad again. But she will not ask forgiveness. The child wept harder. Oh, how I wish she would. I would give my doll's house if she could come up. It is so dreadful for poor Inga. Poor Inga. The words entered the antechamber like 2 drops of clear water falling into a poisoned well. No one had spoken of her that way. Everyone had joined her name to a fault, a warning, or a curse. This innocent child knew what Inga had done and pitied her still. Something moved beneath the stone. It was a very small movement, no more than the trembling of a seed underground. Yet Inga felt it. She wanted to reject the child's pity. She wanted to call it foolish. She wanted to shield herself with anger. Instead, she wanted to weep. No tears came. Her eyes had suffered the crawling feet of flies for years, but they could not make one honest tear. The grief gathered inside her with nowhere to escape, and that became another torment. Above, the little girl grew. Inga remained fixed to the loaf. People spoke of her less often. The song passed out of fashion. Children who had once called her wicked became parents, then grandparents. Roofs were repaired. Trees were cut. New trees rose where the old ones had stood. The cow herd became a bent old man who sometimes woke from dreams of a face trapped inside a bubble. Sound from the earth grew scarce. Then Inga heard a deep sigh. Inga, how miserable you have made me. I knew that you would. They were her mother's dying words. The poor woman lay in the same cottage, beneath rafters still dark with smoke. The hands that had divided bread and ended the suffering of pinned insects were folded over a sunken breast. At the end, her thoughts returned to the beautiful child who had turned away from her by the pond. Inga waited for another voice, another reproach, another burning tear. None came. Her mother was gone. For the first time, Inga understood that there are doors on earth that close forever. Remorse might beg outside them until the stars died, but the hand within would never lift the latch. She remembered the stone by the pond. She imagined walking forward instead of turning away. She imagined taking the bundle of wood from her mother's shoulders. She imagined saying the simple word she had denied them both. Mother. The stone around her heart cracked, but pride poured quickly into the fracture. Inga told herself that the dead needed nothing. She blamed the poor woman for predicting sorrow instead of preventing it. She let bitterness harden over the wound. More years passed. She sometimes heard her former mistress speak of her in the mildest voice. I wonder whether I shall ever see you again, Inga, the woman would say. No one knows where one will go. Inga knew that the kindly mistress would never descend to that antechamber. At last, after a span of time that would have reduced palaces to dust, Inga heard her name again. 2 bright stars appeared high above the darkness. They were eyes, mild and old, closing upon the earth. The little girl who had once wept for poor Inga had lived an entire life. She had grown to womanhood, borne happiness and sorrow, given and received kindness, and become old. Now she lay at the edge of death, where the deeds of a lifetime return in their true shapes. She remembered Inga. My lord, the old woman prayed, have I not also trampled upon your gifts and failed to value them? Have I not carried pride within my own heart? In your mercy, you did not let me sink. Do not forsake me now. Her earthly eyes closed. The eyes of her soul opened. She saw through the soil, through the roots, through the Marsh Woman's brewery, and into the endless antechamber. She saw Inga standing on the loaf. She saw the flies beneath her eyelids, the May bugs turning their needles, the snake in her hair, the hunger eating the hollow shape from within. She saw not a warning in a song, but a soul that had spent years refusing the hand held out to it. In the kingdom of heaven, the gentle soul became like a child again and wept for Inga. Her tears fell. They were not the burning tears of a mother's grief. They were tears without accusation. They passed through the darkness as bright drops, and where they touched the webs of the ancient spiders, the strands smoked and recoiled. One of God's angels was weeping for her. Why, Inga thought, why should such love be given to me? The question pierced deeper than any needle. All the defenses she had built across the years collapsed. She saw every act of her life, not as others had described it, but as it had truly been. The flies dragging themselves across the sill, the beetles turning scraps of paper, the nest falling, her mother's apron beneath her feet, the old woman resting by the pond beneath a load of branches, her mistress placing warm bread in her arms, the loaf sinking under the weight of a clean shoe. She had always imagined herself at the center of every pain. Now she saw the pain radiating outward from her. She saw her mother's, empty, waiting beneath the moon. She saw her father sitting in silence. She saw the good mistress, wondering whether kindness had failed. She saw the sacred labor held within the loaf, seed pressed into earth, grain lifted under rain, backs bent at harvest, stones grinding flour, hands kneading dough, fire giving warmth, a gift carried toward 2 hungry people and thrown instead into filth. Inga did not ask whether her punishment had been fair. She did not blame her parents, her employers, the children, or the staring souls. At last she understood. Sorrow filled her completely. She believed that the gates of mercy could never open for someone like her, and the belief did not make her angry. It made her humble. Then Inga wept. The first tear formed under the feet of the wingless flies. It lifted them gently. Their lost wings appeared, clear and silver, and the insects flew away into the darkness. The tear rolled down her face. Where it passed, the rigid shell split. Light shone through the cracks. The snake in her hair released its coils and fell as a length of rotten rope. The barking toads shrank into drops of mud. The needles turned by the May bugs rusted into red dust. A brilliant ray entered the abyss. It was finer than a thread and stronger than the sun. It struck Inga's stone forehead. For one instant, she saw the great-grandmother recoil and cover her yellow eyes. The Marsh Woman's vats fell silent. Across the antechamber, prisoners lifted faces they had forgotten how to raise. Inga's petrified shape began to dissolve. Stone became mist. Slime became rain. The dress, the fine shoes, and the beauty she had worshipped vanished together. The loaf remained for a final moment, bearing the dark print of her foot. Then it too became light. From the empty place rose a tiny gray bird. It followed the ray upward. The journey passed in an instant. The bird broke through a crack in the earth and entered the night air. It was terrified of the open sky. Every star seemed to see what it had been. Every leaf whispered of the life it had harmed. It flew into a hole in a crumbling wall and hid there, trembling. For a long while, it dared not look out. When it finally raised its head, it beheld the world as Inga had never seen it. Moonlight rested on the fields. Trees moved softly in the wind. Flowers sent their fragrance into the darkness without asking who deserved it. The air was clean. The birds' feathers were small, gray, and neat. No slime clung to them. No snake tightened around its throat. Gratitude swelled in its breast, but it had no voice. It wished to sing like a nightingale. It wished to pour out everything it now understood. Only silence came. Yet the Lord hears the voiceless hymn of the smallest creature. Weeks passed, and Holy Christmas approached. A farmer near the wall raised a pole and tied an unthreshed bundle of oats to it, so the birds of the air might also eat on the day of the Savior. On Christmas morning, sunlight touched the grain. Sparrows and finches gathered, calling to one another. The gray bird peered from the wall. It remembered bread beneath a shoe. It remembered hunger without end. It flew out. A faint sound escaped it. Tweet, tweet. To human ears, it was almost nothing. In heaven, it was a song of joy. That winter became unusually cruel. Ice thickened over the ponds. Snow buried seeds. Animals scratched at frozen earth until their claws bled. Birds fell from branches in the night and lay stiff by morning. The tiny bird searched the country roads. When it found grains of corn in the ruts left by sleds, it ate one grain and called every hungry bird nearby to share the rest. It flew into towns. Wherever kind hands had scattered crumbs outside a window, it took one small crumb and gave all others away. Hunger returned often. It hollowed the bird's light body and made its wings tremble. But this hunger was different. It was freely born. Each time another bird ate, warmth entered the place where stone had once surrounded Inga's heart. All winter, the bird continued. It drew a starving sparrow toward seed hidden beneath a cart. It pushed crumbs from a windowsill to smaller birds that could not reach. It pecked through a crust until the frozen bread broke into pieces many beaks could carry. The weight of what it gave was measured. Somewhere, no scale could be seen. One crumb, another crumb, another. At last, near the end of winter, the bird found a final morsel on a road beside the sea. It was no larger than a fingernail. The bird was weak. Wind tore at its feathers. It had eaten almost nothing that day. A young sparrow landed nearby, too exhausted even to call. The gray bird placed the crumb before it. The sparrow ate. In that instant, the weight of all the grain and bread the bird had found and given away became equal to the weight of the loaf Inga had trodden into the marsh. The gray feathers turned white. The little wings opened wider and wider until they caught a current no earthly wind had made. The bird rose above the road, above the snow, above the fields, where the Marsh Woman's breath no longer frightened it. Children saw the white shape pass over the sea. Look, they cried, a sea swallow. It dipped toward the water, then climbed into the bright sky. Sunlight gathered around it until wings and radiance became impossible to separate. No one on earth saw where it went, but beneath the marsh, the great vats trembled. In the endless antechamber, one ancient web hung broken, and in the fine crust of a loaf cooling on a poor family's table, a little line of light appeared and vanished. So remember, Inga, when pride tells you that a gift is beneath your foot. Remember her when the suffering of something small seems unimportant. Remember the mother waiting beside the cottage, the bread breathing in the mud, and the hunger that waited below. Cruelty may begin with a fly upon a window. Pride may begin with a clean shoe. But mercy may begin with only 2 words spoken for someone whom the world has chosen to condemn. Poor Inga. And that is the tale of the girl who trod on the loaf. Thank you for listening until the end. If this dark retelling kept you company tonight, you can support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing the story with someone who enjoys the colder corners of old folklore. Tell me in the comments which forgotten fairy tale you would like to hear transformed into horror next. Until we meet again, keep a light near the window, be gentle with the smallest creatures, and never step upon the bread. Good night.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment so